Morning, guys. Welcome to day 141 until I'm a YouTube millionaire. I was thinking about what I was talking about yesterday, how there are essentially two forms of instantaneous communication, being either using wormholes to transmit signals without having to traverse the long distances in space, or using quantum entanglement. But then I was also thinking, in that there are essentially infinite frames of reference in the universe in terms of motion vectors, right? So you have the Earth is rotating around the sun at 65,000 miles per hour. The Earth is rotating around its axis at about 1,000 miles per hour. The sun is rotating around the galactic center of the Milky Way at 93 miles per second. And the Milky Way itself is rotating or is moving at 193 miles per second and is on course to collide with the Andromeda galaxy in about 2 billion years or so. Andromeda is actually a bigger galaxy than ours, and our galaxy is a pretty large galaxy relative to what we know to exist. It's kind of in the same vicinity as the sun is with respect to other stars, in the 85th percentile from what we've seen so far. And we have a pretty good sampling of the universe. So even though we only can monitor about 2% of the sky, and it's a big-ass sky, that 2% is enough to know roughly those kinds of percentiles and whatnot. So I'm thinking to myself, there's two different ways you can do this instantaneous communication. However, there's a necessity for anchoring because of all those different frames of reference and the different motion vectors. If that be the case, how would one actually properly anchor to something? And then it occurred to me, actually, not only could the entanglement be used for instantaneous communication in a binary manner, but you could also use it as itself an anchor. Let's say you decide to do photon splitting as one of the means by which you entangle two different particles. And then one of those particles is attached to the teleporter or the wormhole. And the other particle is on the surface of the Earth or the surface of Mars or something. Well, they'll always be correlated to one another. So no matter where you go in time and space, time equals space, based upon Einstein's theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, all that stuff, right? So that might actually be how the anchoring mechanism works. They had an idea of this in Avengers Endgame when Iron Man, Tony Stark, developed the temporal GPS, is what he called it. Either time can go inside, either time moves within you, or you move within time. There we go. Okay. So Ant-Man, as a result, was going through his entire range of ages. He was a baby, he was a 14-year-old, he was an 85-year-old, and then came back to where he was originally, his normal self. Because time was moving within himself as opposed to him moving within time. And the temporal GPS that Tony Stark developed, I don't know, it might have something to do with that. Because we know how to entangle particles now. And if we know how to entangle particles, and we can do it in a repeatable manner, reliably repeatable manner, and that entanglement can sustain, in other words, we don't have to constantly be working on it to keep it that way. Like, maybe if you entangle two different particles that are separated by the universe, you have to constantly give a certain amount of photon energy to one particle for them to stay entangled. So assuming that either A, that requirement is not there, they just stay permanently entangled, or we can actually keep that energy input going into it to keep it entangled, then you could make an anchor in that way. You need an anchor. There's too many motion vectors in existence. So if you're trying just to make it work within your 3 dimensions, that is by itself a Herculean effort. Just teleportation, not even trying to move through time. It's a Herculean effort because of all those different motion vectors. But then you take on top of that moving through time, and the whole thing gets 1,000 times more complicated. And then on top of that, let's say you're trying to catch somebody who is also moving through time. Well, now it's 1,000 times more complicated because you guys are going to zoom right past one another. And actually, I'm talking a little bit about that in my novel series right now, the point where I am in my writing, where Emily, the female lead in the story, is about to meet up with the Greys. The Greys are trying to find a way to encounter her because she's traveling through time in her machine. And they just figured out how to build a time machine themselves and are trying to reconnect with her because they're actually descendants of humanity. So, yeah. You need a proper anchor. So I posit this to you guys, not just because I think it's a pretty interesting idea, but also because if any of you can think of something with respect to anchoring when you're moving through time and space that might work, or maybe even work better than what I've explained, this is just working in hypotheticals right now. Basically developing the infrastructure for the ideas so that when the day comes where we actually do have fully usable time travel technology, we will have some idea of how exactly to use it. So, yeah. If you have any ideas, let me know. That's it for today. All right, guys. Love y'all. Peace.